Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our panel discussion today, Strategies for Implementing and Operating Zero Trust. Thank you all for joining us. My name is John Evans, and I'm the Chief Technology Advisor for State and Local Government and Education at Worldwide Technology. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to today's webcast. It's presented by Worldwide Technology and Forcepoint. So today we're going to talk a little bit about zero trust, obviously, and combating the sophistication and volume of cyber attacks that government agencies face on a daily basis requires more than just technology. Zero Trust offers a holistic strategy and framework that's not tied to a single technology and enables IT and agency leaders to promote and support enterprise-wide shifts in where and how access is provided to data and/or systems and applications. As agencies consider a Zero Trust model, where should they begin beyond the security teams? These are common topics of discussion. So we're gonna jump in, and during the webcast, we're gonna explore some of the cultural foundations of Zero Trust and dive into how to assess the risks and maturity of your current cyber posture. Hopefully, we'll be able to leave you today with practical takeaways and some best practices for implementing the following pillars of a Zero Trust architecture. Those pillars, the way that we kind of view them, are data discovery and inventory, data classification, data protection, and user identity and privilege access. And what do we mean when we talk about those pillar topics? So data discovery and inventory is really how to gain visibility into all of the endpoints on your network. Where is the data? What data is out there and where is it? Data classification is essentially organizing that data by relevant categories so that it can be used and protected more effectively and efficiently. Data protection, once discovered, inventoried, and classified, how do we monitor and protect the data based on its risk and value to the enterprise? And user identity and privilege access, how to provide the right access to the right people at the right time. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of the platform, you'll find several icons, including the Q&A tab, which will allow you to ask a question. We'll be fielding those towards the end of the program, provided that we have time. We're definitely going to try to get to them all. But feel free to submit questions at any point along the way, just as you're thinking of them, so that you don't lose the question along the way. And if you experience any technical difficulties, just click on the help icon, and a member of our support team will assist you. Joining us today, we have Brian Campo, Deputy CTO for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. We have Victor Martinez, Senior Solutions Engineering Manager at Forcepoint, and Kevin Finch, who is the Global Security Strategist at Worldwide Technology. Thank you all for joining me today. Let's do some quick intros. Brian, would you like to start us off, please?
Yeah, absolutely, John. Thank you for having me. So Brian Campo, I am the Deputy Chief Technology Officer at the Department of Homeland Security, also the Chief Enterprise Architect, and as of this week, I'm also the Acting CTO. So wear a lot of hats, but definitely interesting. Zero Trust is one of the main things that CTO has been trying to take on this year. And, I think we've got an interesting approach, and really looking forward to talking about it.
Thank you. Vic, you want to give us a quick introduction, please?
Yeah, Victor Martinez with Forcepoint. I am a Solutions Engineering Manager at Forcepoint. I've got a background in IT infrastructure. One of the first companies I worked for was a company called Cabletron, which back in early 2000s was a competitor to Cisco, and also background in cyber. So currently I am the SME for Zero Trust at Forcepoint.
Great, thank you. And Kevin?
Absolutely, yeah. Kevin Finch with Worldwide Technology. I'm part of the global security practice here, and I lead technical strategy, and I lead our Zero Trust program within Worldwide.
Perfect. Thank you all very much for being here. Just going to jump into it. So first question. In June of 2020, Forcepoint sponsored a Government Business Council issued survey on Zero Trust, where they surveyed a random sample of 121 federal government employees. The respondents, 3 out of 4 of the respondents, thought that Zero Trust is a vital component to their agency's cybersecurity. I'm going to throw this out to the group, maybe Brian, but I'd love to hear from Kevin and Vic also. What do we think has led to this model in government, the adoption of this model?
Yeah, so I can start. I think primarily it has to do a lot with, sort of the way we look at security in the government. The idea of the castle and moat, right, where everything's inside of a protected boundary, where, we have 100% control over traffic moving in and out. That really is an archaic way to look at security. And I think Zero Trust gives us tools, techniques, practices that we can use as we're moving out to the cloud. As we're moving off of VPN, right? We'll probably talk a little bit about how COVID is affecting, the work that we do, the technology work that we do. But moving away from the idea that everything's on our network, moving out to the cloud, moving folks into a telework posture, working with software as a service. Those sorts of things don't lend themselves to the idea that we've got a protected boundary, right? We don't have, we don't even have a boundary anymore, right? Our boundaries are amorphous. The idea that we can control the traffic that moves into and out of any of our cloud providers. And then, I think the other piece of it is we're trying to take more proactive control over our data. We're going to talk quite a bit about data, but data can't be treated as an all-in-one asset, right? All data is not equal. We can't necessarily give somebody access to all the data in an application, and that's something that we've known for a while. But even as data is traversing a network, even as endpoints are moving across different boundaries in the network, Zero Trust is really the vital aspect that gives us control over, or more granular control over, things like endpoints that you have access to, as well as the data.
Absolutely, all really good points. Vic, are you or Kevin, whichever of you would like to jump in here on this one?
In complete agreement with Brian, I think that one thing that Forcepoint has kind of has took to heart is the fact that the new boundary is really layer 8. It's the person, right? We work now from everywhere, right? So work is more of an outcome versus a location. And, the mentality that, when you're inside boundaries, that you're somehow safe and that everything inside these boundaries is going to be in your control, like Brian said, that's an archaic idea, right? So I think the paradigm shift here is, really anywhere you sit, whether it's a Starbucks, whether it's an airport, the hotel, or inside the boundary of your organization, you really have to consider that network to be hostile. Everything around you. And then, from that perspective, then you can truly understand, that the person, the device, you have to protect that as the boundary and then go from there. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Considering everything possible, I think is one of those key tenets of Zero Trust. So good points. Kevin, how about you? What have you seen in the space?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's, a lot of similarities when you look at the challenges, because I got the opportunity to kind of see how people are addressing this globally, not just from an agency perspective. And I think the thing that's relevant for everybody is the growth rate on data is just continuing to grow. It's this explosive growth. So you take the thing that you're trying to protect and you say, all right, the amount of what you're trying to protect is growing at an astronomical rate. And then I think you compare that with the architectural shift, which Brian was talking a little bit about earlier, right, of telework and digital transformation and cloud. All of those things are really kind of bumping up against it. So there has to be a different way that you look and go after security architecture in that fashion, because it comes back to the way that policy and networks were designed then, how it's responding to the architectural shift now, just doesn't provide the same level of confidence and trust, right? Going back to some of those implicit trust manners. So, I think you'll begin to kind of see how a lot of that unfolds as we begin to kind of talk through that. But I see that being a huge driver and catalyst when we start talking about Zero Trust, the rate of data and the architectural shift that's impacting it.
Yeah, and one thing to kind of tie off of that, I think the threat vectors have significantly changed in the last couple of years as well, right? So, one of the things that we're seeing is, the idea that there are no trusted devices anymore, right? Every endpoint is assumed to be hostile, really is grounded in fact, right? We're seeing new threat vectors come in. We're seeing vectors that we really didn't have defenses for a year or two ago. And rather than trying to keep up with every possible outcome that could lead to a new threat vector, Zero Trust gives us some more generic tools, so that what we're looking at is, every request is a different action. So we revalidate credentials, we revalidate access, we rethink should this particular asset or endpoint or user actually be trying to request this particular thing. So it just gives us a more proactive posture when we think about the threat vector as well. And I'd be really interested in what that other 1 out of 4 think is vital to security if they're not lining up for Zero Trust.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, no, and what you were talking about, the increase in the amount of threat vectors, I think that is probably one of the primary driving factors towards this shift in cybersecurity. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. That's an excellent point. I'm gonna Kevin, we'll talk a little bit more in one of the subsequent questions about what you were mentioning around the explosion of data, or the astronomical increase in the amounts of data that are coming into the agencies. So question number 2, Brian. NIST recently published a Zero Trust architecture, and I believe Sean Connolly at CISA was one of the contributing editors, and he's on your team there at Homeland Security. How important do you think this guidance will be for agencies going further as they move towards adapting the Zero Trust principles?
Yeah, I mean, I think overarching guidance like the NIST guidance and the CISA guidance are extremely important, right? I mean, what they do is they sort of set a ground level truth for what we want to do as we're implementing Zero Trust. One of the tangential things to that is the idea of the TIC, right? So there is also a TIC modernization effort. You may have heard of TIC 3.0, which goes right along with Zero Trust. So I think those fundamental things are a great way for everybody to kind of work towards the same goals with Zero Trust. It certainly helps us, gives us a language and a set of base properties to interact with industry when we're thinking about Zero Trust. But they are just that, right? They're sort of a base fundamental guidance as to what you want to do. It's still up to each agency to understand their risk posture, to understand the threat vectors that are most important to them, and develop their own, right? So while we've got CISA as part of DHS, we're also developing our own Zero Trust guidance. We just finalized the final draft of our 2-year Zero Trust roadmap, right? So we started working on some use cases, some more customer-focused activities that we could do. Really tried to focus on some early implementations rather than, kind of going into a lab and coming out with, a big bang approach to Zero Trust. We looked at some incremental phased approaches for Zero Trust. And what we did was we took what NIST put out, we worked with Sean directly, and then we looked at how can we apply this to make things better, especially as we were moving into the telework environment. Looking at getting rid of VPN, trying to use things like Cloud Security Gateway, Cloud Access Security Broker, to really give us pathways that didn't require a VPN to some of our cloud assets. Those are the sorts of things that you're not going to see specifically in some of that overarching guidance that the agency is going to still have to do. But I think those fundamental pieces are really important, and I think they give you a common lexicon. Gives us ways to kind of guide industry into what we're looking for, how we're going to use Zero Trust, and then it also helps us, as we're working together, right? I mean, DHS has been working with other departments across the federal government, to try and collaborate on some things, because Zero Trust is evolving as quickly as any technology I've seen over the last couple of years. So I think I really applaud NIST for getting so far out ahead of this and putting out some really good guidance. CISA certainly is looking at where the effects of that Zero Trust guidance are going to play within the federal government. But I'd also say, the departments take a big role in trying to figure out where Zero Trust is going to go for them, and then figuring out where we collaborate. So really, there's 4 aspects to how you want to look at Zero Trust from a guidance perspective.
Yeah, no, really good points. Coming up with that common lexicon, as well as sort of that phased approach. What does that roadmap look like? Where do I get started? Those are things I think that have been top of mind to a lot of the customers that we've been talking to. Kevin, would you agree with that, that those have been kind of some of the big asks from a lot of the customers that we've been talking to also?
Yeah, I mean, we really see customers kind of fall in a few different categories. We have customers that are kind of coming out of that research phase where there's a lot of buzz about zero trust. So they're going through those efforts there to try to figure out what does that really mean for our organization and how is it applicable, or our agency rather. Then it's the strategy development part of it, right? It's that idea of, right, do I look to build this large enterprise architecture that encompasses all of these zero trust principles? Or do I take a specific use case with a risk-based approach to address some of the more common areas, right, that I need to kind of tackle from that perspective? Then the other two buckets is the architectural and the implementation piece. I think the interesting part of it is, zero trust, or the concept, has been out for a couple decades, and you look at, all right, what is the practical implementation of that? Where are the vendors with that? Where's the industry with that? How is agency responding to that? And I do commend NIST on putting that guidance out, because I think it provides a common body of knowledge for people to organize themselves around. And I think you got to have that for something like zero trust, because it's not a single team. It's not a single agency. There may be collaboration and those things that have to happen between multiple organizations or agencies to get to that outcome. So you're going to need that level of guidance. You're going to need that level of commonality to be able to address some of those challenges, even if it's use case specific or much broader kind of, enterprise architectural approach.
Yeah, good point. Vic, I think you had shown us earlier, if you'd like to pull it up again, it's up to you, but there was an architectural diagram that shows some of the considerations to take into account as you're moving towards the zero trust framework, and then sort of what that in-state architecture at a very high level might look like. Oh, yep, there it is. I was going to say, if you think it's a good point or relevant here, you might want to talk us through that really quickly.
I think so. Both Brian and Kevin mentioned language, and I think that's extremely important. So as we talk through these concepts, I think that just level setting the architecture is pretty important for those who may not have seen this before. So what we have here is kind of the base level architecture of zero trust as defined per 800-207 NIST. On the outskirts of this diagram, you have signals that are coming into the system and are ingested into the system and consumed by the system. The white block is basically the solution or the system, with everything above the tethered line being the control plane, meaning where decisions are made, and everything below the line is the data plane, which is where the packets fly, as well as where the enforcement happens. Now, the PDP in this diagram stands for policy decision point, and policy enforcement point is PEP. So if you hear us use those two acronyms, you'll know what we're referring to. But within the control plane, what we've done at Forcepoint, and the reason why I believe this is such a powerful thing to have this common language, is that we've overlaid kind of our solutions and how we fit into this architecture, so we can communicate to our customers and our prospects with contextual information about zero trust. So we have a UEBA, user-ending behavior analytics solution, which we call FBA, Forcepoint behavior analytics, which sits on top of our solution as the brain, and enforces and informs our policy enforcement points, such as DLP, such as CASB, such as firewalls, to enforce actions on the network. So that's the general architecture. I know that's taken about 2 or 3 minutes, and we should want to move on, but hopefully that's helpful.
I got caught on mute there. Sorry about that. No, it's very helpful. I think being able to level set what we're talking about, what that in-state architecture, the ideal architecture, and what some of the guidance is in a visual format, I think probably did help. So thank you. All right, let's. So we're going to move into the pillars now, and first pillar being data discovery and inventory. Let's talk a little bit about why that's important to implementing and operating a zero trust framework. Forcepoint, maybe you want to kick us off here, Vic, with some best practices regarding data discovery and inventory that you guys are seeing.
Yeah, sure. I would say that don't allow data discovery to be something that is analysis through paralysis. It's something that you start and you iterate. I don't think you're ever going to finish your data discovery because data transforms. There's a life cycle to data, right? People create new data, data is shared, data is deleted, right? So the life cycle. So you have to iterate and really go through a process and have a philosophy of data discovery that's continual, that's an evolution of your knowledge base within the context of IT and Zero Trust. So really, start there, but don't allow that to be, again, a gate to doing anything else. It can be done in parallel with other steps of Zero Trust. And, you can do data discovery and begin the journey and continue the journey without having to, have a stamp that says I finished data discovery, right? That's my my advice.
That makes a lot of sense. Kevin, anything you'd like to add on to that?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate here. I think just you kind of hear me use this a couple of times, I think, throughout this session. Visibility is going to be key, regardless of what stage you're in. So having visibility to your data, I think, is a critical first step. And, to Victor's point, having a tool to be able to assist you in the discovery of that, and then having some practices around just, basic data hygiene, right? If this is data that can be deconstructed, no longer needed, is de-scoping the amount of data that you're going to have even in there to discover to begin with. But I think the other part of kind of going through that discovery, I like to look at it that there's some aspects that you're going to get from the tool just by default of the technology, but then there's other aspects where you're going to need context, right? So you need to start looking at it through the lens where you're asking yourself types of questions like, what sensitive data do I have? Where is it? And who needs access? So once you start going through that, it's not always easily identifiable when you begin to look at sensitivity, risk level, value, and stuff of that data, actually how that flows. And I think you got to have that baseline, because when you get through this and further down the track, I think you'll understand that there's connective tissue between these pillars. There's connective tissues between a lot of the different functions. Victor had mentioned kind of the policy enforcement points that's ingesting a lot of these different signals. So the biggest idea here is that we're coming from a legacy model where we were using metrics that they do not provide the proper level of context. So having that as a baseline, coming back into that policy enforcement point, the whole idea is to build out the right level of context. When you start looking at that, asking yourself those contextual questions, that's going to sit outside of this tool. It's going to be adjacent to that technical tool that you have there doing the discovery process. So just making sure that you have that overarching resource or person that kind of understands, from a discovery perspective, what needs to be in scope. Should it be in scope? Is it still data that needs to be alive, right? Does it need to be deleted or decommissioned? I'm always looking at requirement 0, which is scope reduction. So if there's an opportunity to reduce the amount of data that you even have in your viewpoint from that point of view, I think is a good best practice and a good starting point.
Yeah, Kevin, excellent. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Was someone jumping in there?
Oh, no. So, yeah, I was going to jump in. I mean, I completely agree with them. I think data discovery, if you think fundamentally from a Zero Trust perspective, previously we were doing security by saying this request to this system, is allowed or disallowed, right? If we think about Zero Trust gives us that next layer down, right? So if we're discovering the data that's within our applications, that gives us that next level of granular control, right? So, rather than saying, you can get access to the system and you can do whatever you want, or the system itself has to manage the permissions for that user, now we can actually discover the data that's in there. We can give, controlled access down to the different data points, right? So, rather than having unilateral access to maybe everything that a role allows us, we might actually use the policy enforcement point and the policy decision point to say, this person probably should have access to the system and probably should be able to do this function, but these data points aren't necessarily related to what they should be doing. So it really gives us a consistency for that next granular level of data, where you've got an overall holistic view of what users have access to, where they can go with the data, and you're sort of you're giving yourself that insurance for a system compromise or something like that, where you can actually positively manage the data that's flowing through the network between different endpoints.
Yeah, excellent points, Brian. And the combination of the discussion now just made me kind of think. Kevin talked a little bit about one of the ways to kind of manage that explosion of data that he mentioned earlier when he was talking about the principles around data minimization. Is that thing, or how, I guess, are you guys looking to help to tackle that issue of just so much more data that's going to be coming? It's been happening recently, and it's only going to increase. What other types of strategies are you guys looking towards to help kind of manage that increasing ingestion influx of data?
So from the department's perspective, right? So up until very recently, the chief data officer lived within the chief technology officer, right? So the stand-up of the CDO organization was something that the CTO took on. So we've been looking at a lot of different concerns on the data side, and I agree. I think DHS, because of the breadth of our missions, right? So if you think about DHS's missions, we do disaster recovery, we do border management, we do import export. We have the CISA folks who are managing cybersecurity for the nation. We've got such a broad range of what we do that our data needs are astronomical. And then the data that we are collecting every day, I think we probably even beat the norm, which is 10 to 20x every year. We're seeing our data ballooning every time we're doing an inventory. So, trying to get data under control has been a challenge. I think what we've been looking at is trying to take it in sort of what we're calling a portfolio or a segment approach, right? So we're looking at the major portfolios that we've got. So, biometrics, immigration, customs, border protection. We're looking at those groups and sort of trying to understand where their data needs are, understanding the types of data that we've got, and then trying to compare that with the data inventory that we've got within the department. So, one of the things that we tried to do over the last year is we were sort of creating a foundation for the CDO was to separate out data into these portfolios, look across all of the different portfolios that the data needs, and then try to make some connections, right? Try to create some consistency, because I think that's the biggest thing that we've seen is, 5 different systems need the same type of data, but they're storing it 5 different ways. Using meme models, for instance, to try and create consistent standards for data, which then allows us to manage the data better, allows us to actually be in positive control of the data, whether it's coming from system A or system B. And at some points, we're combining system data. So, those are really where we've tried to take a look at it is, creating consistency in the data, trying to manage the data from a portfolio level, and then really trying to understand the interconnectedness of different data from different systems that have relationships between them.
That was an excellent segue, I would say, into the next pillar of data classification. You gave us a lot of really good information about why the data classification is so important to the transition to zero trust, and yeah, that was perfect. We couldn't have planned that better. So thank you. And then maybe you can give us a little bit more, just pulling that thread a little bit further. Any other, specifically around the data classification piece, you definitely hit on that in your last answer. It was great, but any other sort of lessons learned, best practices that you're seeing from either DHS or out in the industry around data classification?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we learned, and we learned it about halfway through trying to work with a couple of the portfolios, was understanding the value add of the data, right? So, a lot of times when you're coming from a chief data officer or a data manager's perspective, you're thinking of the data as these cold, hard elements. There's a lot of context that leads to the value add of the data. Trying to get that understood and creating those contextual elements can sometimes be the much harder part of it. And those context elements, right? So when you combine 3 pieces of data, you're actually creating new information. Those context elements are vitally important and often get overlooked. We all know about how PII works, right? You combine 3 data points and you become PII, where none of the points by themselves would be PII. So you're creating concerns for your data. And the classification of the data has to be done both at the data element level, but also at the aggregated data context level. And I think that was a hard lesson for us to learn. That was something that, I think we all know that, but we don't think about it in day to day when we're trying to catalog data, or we're trying to synthesize data, or even sometimes when we're trying to aggregate and consolidate data. So that was probably the biggest lesson learned for us. Understand the context of the data, understand how the aggregation of data changes it. And then you also have to apply those same security principles to the aggregated data, to the information that's created from the data. So, I think there are a lot, and there's probably 100 other lessons learned I could give you, but that's really the one that sticks out in my mind from the past 6 months to a year for us.
That's a great lessons learned. You talked about PII, and that's an easy example, I think, for a lot of people to wrap their heads around. But it's much more complex as you start talking about aggregation of data and classification levels in terms of national security classifications, and much more critical to get those classifications right. So thank you. That was great. In terms of the classification of data, just overall, and maybe not even looking at it through a purely or a national security centric lens, but if we view data classification as just sort of that organization of data by relevant categories, as a step towards making sure that we're able to use the data and protect the data as best we can. Kevin, any other anything to add there on either side of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought Brian did an amazing job of breaking that down. So thank you, Brian. Right. So I think it goes into how you assess it, right? And I think there's some basic things that you can walk away with when you're assessing the data, because where I'm in violent agreement with Brian is the combination of, adding those different pieces of data together to create new information, is an interesting point, right? But when you begin to assess your data, you ask yourself some questions individually, right? Like, how critical is this data to my day-to-day, operations, right? How does this data need to be available around the clock, right? So as you begin to put controls and those different things around it, if something's affecting the availability of that data, right, it may prove itself not to be the right path to go down. And then you start looking at sensitivity, integrity, and retainability. So going back to, does this data need to be retained? What are the protections of this data and stuff when it's at rest? So when you begin to look at all of those things, I think it gives you a way to kind of balance how you're going to handle that data once you kind of answered all of those different questions from that degree. But I did want to go back and just provide a few points that Brian was talking about, kind of consistency in the approach. We've already kind of talked about, this explosive rate and kind of data, the growth rates associated with that, right? So I think when you're looking at classifying it too, you also got to have, automation has to be part of that to some degree. And I think it's a few different ways that you can look and understand and kind of figure out how that's applicable. But, there's always the manual effort, right? Which is not always going to drive consistency. There's going to be a significant amount of effort with that. And you really can't keep up with the life cycle of data at that rate with just kind of a manual kind of approach. Then there's the fully automated approach, right? That lacks context. So going back to the earlier examples and using Brian's point where 1 + 1 is 3, or, PHI in that example, that requires context, right? So automation is not necessarily going to solve that problem for you. So then you're going to have a hybrid approach where you're taking context of what just about how you guys do business and the aspects of your data, but combining that with automation to remove repeatable tasks and have a consistent way of doing it. So I think when you look at it compartmentalized that way, it really gives you a pathway to address data and try to keep up with it as it's growing.
This was those were great answers, both of you. It really dovetailed in nicely. Thank you both. Really, I think a very comprehensive answer there. So let's jump over to the next question. Vic, I'm going to throw this over to you first, if you don't mind. So we've talked about discovery, inventory, classifying the data. Can you talk to us a little bit more about the next step in the zero trust journey? Why the protection of that data is such a pivotal step, and any sort of best practices that you're seeing around that sort of zero trust pillar?
Yeah, so I think that once you know where your data resides, once you classify your data, then the next logical step is to be able to protect that data and have context around how you protect that data. So your classic data loss prevention tools, the classic difficulty with deploying those types of tools is that you have a static set of policies that are applied across a broad organization, so it's difficult to apply policies that are specific to an individual, that don't hinder the productivity of that individual, and that are stringent enough that provide enough protection. So really what the industry has done for a lot of the DLP deployments is they've gone to a monitor-only mode where your DLP solution and your DLP policies really inform when data moves, but there hasn't been a whole lot of enforcement. So what we've seen at Forcepoint is that when you couple behavior and understanding behavior with the data loss prevention, you essentially add those two solutions together and create a next generation data loss prevention solution. So the behavior aspects and understanding that allow you to what we state as free the good but stop the bad. So if an individual is always follows the rules, is not a risky individual to the organization, doesn't have a proclivity or a tendency to do negative things or visit negative sites, right? All those things go into the equation and compose a trust score or a risk score for that individual. And as a result of that risk score, we can then drive policy that says, okay, this individual has the ability to copy data onto a USB thumb drive, or burn data onto a CD, or copy data to a certain file share, or copy data from a certain file share. But if that same individual goes to a Starbucks, becomes compromised, and all of a sudden their account starts acting erratically, and the system will detect the difference in behavior. It will ratchet up the risk score and apply a different set of policies to that same individual that then stop certain actions from occurring. So again, the coupling of understanding behavior and a control point or a policy enforcement point like DLP, we believe is the right approach, because again, it allows you to allow productivity to occur, not hinder productivity on individuals that are not risky, but at the same time stop risky behavior and stop exfiltration events when they when they happen. So that's the approach we've been taking, and we've been seeing a lot of customers benefit from that type of approach. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it does. Yeah, no, that decision point or enforcement point based architecture as a part of the zero trust framework. Absolutely, very important. And Brian, you were talking a little bit earlier about how we transition to this type of an architecture, this type of a mindset. I guess maybe even one of the large drivers is the increase in the amount of attack vectors that we're seeing. We kind of had to adopt this trust nothing type of approach. Is there anything else you'd like to add, sort of on that topic around the data protection? Any best practices you guys are seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll start off by echoing something that Victor mentioned, which is that idea that there is no predefined security, right? We are with zero trust and with some of the tooling that you get with that, some of the the policy enforcement point, the policy decision point. What you're doing is you're looking at every single request as a new request for a resource. You're not saying this particular role always has access to X. We're looking at things like impossible travel, right? So if we get a request from a user account, even from a known endpoint, right? Sitting in DC, and then 5 minutes later we're getting a request from China. That's a really good positive indicator, right? So zero trust not only is giving us better ways to handle security, it's giving us different paradigms. It's giving us different different sort of defense vectors, right? So we've got these ideas of sets of criteria. The other piece to think about is that we're doing policy enforcement point not at the endpoint, or not at the gateway anymore, right? We're doing it on the endpoint. We're doing it in the if you've got a CASB or a CSG, we're doing it there. We're doing it in different traversal points across the network. So there is no, there's not just one access mechanism anymore. We're doing it at every step along the way, and each one can take a different set of factors in place, right? On the endpoint, we might be looking at GPS location. We might be looking at, was a PIV used or was it username password? We might be looking at other things that are installed on that endpoint. When they come into the CSG, we might be looking at the route that they traveled. So there's not only this idea of more data available to use to make the decision as to whether to grant access to a resource, but we've got different perspectives we can use. We've got much more context that we can use, and we can really build these viable identity profiles all the way along, and allow each stage of the policy decision to make exactly the right decision that it needs to make. And then I think the other aspect that's really interesting is, we're seeing people working from many more untrusted locations, right? Before we could say that, a person was only ever going to work inside a building or, in a controlled access point. We're seeing people, like you said, working in coffee shops, working from their house, being on the same network in their house as a potentially, a potentially damaged computer, right? Sharing a network, sharing a Wi-Fi connection. Their personal router may have been compromised. So, the idea that, we're working much more remotely, we're working from a lot more untrusted locations, I think zero trust becomes absolutely vital. It is effectively one of the most important aspects, frameworks for security that we've seen, especially given the current times.
Yeah, excellent points. What you were talking about not having that single access point or mechanism, and there being continuous checks along the way to provide a risk-based assessment about if access not just should be allowed, but continue to be allowed. Excellent points. And then you transitioned really nicely again into the next pillar, the next topic, which is the user identity and privileged access. I think in answering the last question, you answered some of how we start to develop that user identity, the thought that goes into the user identity practices when you're migrating to a zero trust framework. Let's go a little bit deeper with that, if you don't mind, and maybe expand on that a little bit and get into how that ties into privilege access management systems also. If you could, please, Brian.
Yeah, so identity, right? I think one of the challenges that we've had, and I'll kind of start with one of the challenges that we've had at DHS, and kind of expand that out into more of a general principle. So DHS, again, we've got broad mission sets, we've got functional components that sort of have to operate independently in some aspects. They have to operate from unknown locations all the time. FEMA, for instance, going into a disaster area, right? There's not a network available for them, so they've got to establish a network. And they, sometimes they have to run offline until we can get backhaul for them. So one of the challenges that we've run into, and one of the things that we did over the past year, was really focus on creating true singular identities, right? The fact that we've got for O365, for example, we've got tenants, right? So we don't have one big Active Directory that everybody in DHS is in. We've got an Active Directory that sort of aggregates multiple other Active Directories. And there was potential for an ID that comes in from CBP to the network to be different from the DHS CBP user if they were on the network, right? So sort of figuring out how to coalesce those identities, figuring out how to take and manage a person, right? A user in all their forms as a singular thing, right? Because it does no good to have all these policy enforcement and policy decision points doing all this great work if you can't aggregate the identity of a user. So, for us, that was a big task that we took on last year, and really trying to work across how the network was going to be modernized. We also started looking at, how can we start to do some of these fundamental things that are going to give us a better posture for taking Zero Trust forward.
I really appreciate the level of detail and access that you're giving us, kind of sort of some of the behind the scenes peaks or best practices, what you guys have encountered. This is really a great discussion because of that. Thank you, Brian. I'm going to kick this over to Kevin. Kevin, could you dig a little bit, into the user identity and privilege access in regards to Zero Trust conversation for us, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And I got a few other points that I want to just hit really quickly because I think it ties into this very well. So I think, the user persona aspect that Brian and Victor are both talking about, and I think that's going to be critical, especially when you start talking about identity and privilege access management. Because one of the other things, too, that I think as we go into that conversation coming out of the data protection part of it, it's critical that you understand how sensitive data flows through the organization. Because if you can understand how it flows through the organization, then you got a better idea of how that data can be compromised or extracted. So when you start looking at identity, let's just agree that that's a critical capability. I've heard a lot of people kind of start with that, or they try to make identity Zero Trust. Identity's been around for quite some time. I think it's about how it integrates into the overall architecture, because the point of it is you're trying to establish a source of truth. And that source of truth, when we start looking at identity, it's person and non-person entities, right? I think it's pretty easy to tie that line back to a user, but that user also needs to come from a trusted device. You need to understand the identity of that device. And then going back to a comment that Brian made earlier, it's all the way down to the system in the session. It's not always a user kind of coming in as the subject trying to get access to a resource. So when I'm looking at identity, I'm looking at it holistically to say, all right, is this user authorized and authenticated to have access to this resource? And are they coming from a trusted device? Do I have enough, right, to build a trust kind of profile going back to that user persona? And I think you also got things like the UBA aspect of it, which is going to give you outside intelligence to kind of feed back into that context part of it, because somebody made the comment earlier that we were basing, implicit trust on kind of network assignment. You come from this VLAN, or this is the source, this is the destination. We know it's much greater than that. But, when you start looking at privilege access management as well, I think you can tie pretty much a ton of different cyber events back to someone getting access to privileged credentials and doing something inappropriate with those credentials. So when you're looking at privilege access, don't look at it just as a secrets management or vaulting type aspect. Look at that holistically, right? From an infrastructure perspective, from a cloud perspective, because that, understanding that we're talking about the data to that point, but if we look at how that data is accessed and how Zero Trust works, it's looking to establish this source of truth and have enough context and confidence that this session should be approved or allowed, which is going to come back to what is your basic hygiene, what's your basic approach for privilege access management. What it can't be is it can't be just off to the side, hey, we're going to create a vault, or we're going to have a jump box and just kind of dump somebody into it. It needs to be part of the overall architecture. So the diagram that Victor had up, I would highly encourage everybody, when you're working through these, when you're thinking through these things, don't think about them independently. Think about it in the aspects of how is it integrating, how is it plugging back into the trust algorithm, how is it coming back into the policy enforcement point. So, my direction there, don't have it be its independent approach and work through it and figuring out, how it's going to tie back into Zero Trust. Make it an element that is in parallel as you're going down that journey. You need to make sure that you're establishing trust for both person and non-person entities. So it's not just going to be the user, it's going to be the systems and services as well.
Thank you. Excellent points. And, I think you gave the listeners some of those, actionable takeaways that we kind of promised them at the beginning. So thank you. Would anyone else, Brian, were you trying to jump back in there? I heard somebody. I wasn't sure who it was, though. No. Okay. Vic, did you want to add anything else?
That I could add to that. So Kevin mentioned the kind of integration of UEBA and the ICANN vendor. That's something that we are thinking and doing right now. We are integrating with, the sale points, and the Tings and the Oktas of the world so that we can provide a risk score from the UEBA back to those vendors. And then they can take an action based on what we're seeing from the UEBA side of the business. Because we're able to see so many different signals at, at that policy decision point and get a contextual view, a much broader view, holistic view of the network, providing that back to the ICANN vendor is very useful to them to then change access, whether it be privileged access management or just force someone to recertify access into a specific application.
Thank you. Excellent points. And everyone kind of touched on a similar theme, I think, here, that it's something that can't be considered in isolation. It has to be more of a holistic strategy. So that was really, really good. I think that, the way that y'all kind of hit that, but from a different perspective.
And John, to make one other point, if you don't mind, I forgot to make it. So the other thing that I want to make it also needs to be continuous in nature, right? So when we're talking about the trust aspect, I think one of the differences, right, when you're looking at zero trust, those policy assignments were pretty static. We're going to interrogate a user or a session to see if they're authorized and authenticated and permitted to have access to this resource, and then they were just kind of dumped into that network. Now there's this common body of knowledge and this guidance here that says, all right, we're going to do that upon the initial request, but we're also going to go back and do that throughout the life cycle of the session. So if something changes, right, with the device trust or the user trust or the state of the endpoint, now we can take a measure, to Victor's point, right, especially if we got a risk score, right, we can ingest that into the policy orchestration, and it's no longer a binary decision of yes or no or on or off. Maybe there's a judgment call on the level of access that you will grant or promote, and still address the kind of work from anywhere, but maybe you're only giving read access, right? If the device is coming back as, an unmanaged device, but kind of still allow somebody to kind of get access into that. So I did want to just kind of hit that aspect of it, that I did hint that there is a continuous piece to that they're just not checking the identity of the device, the user at the start of that session, but it's actually throughout until that session is terminated.
Yeah, no, excellent point. That's something that Brian touched on in his answer also, that it's a continuous check, and the permissions are not static based on that continuous check either. So, good point. All the interplay here is really, really good. So we've made it through the pillars, kind of what that roadmap looks like. I think there was a lot of good tips and guidance given here today, practical guidance about what these industry experts are government and industry experts, apologies, Brian, are seeing in this space. We have a couple questions here. Let's maybe kick it over to the questions and see if we can get through one or two of those in the about 5 minutes that we have left. So the first question I see here is, does the feel of zero trust psychologically to a cybersecurity professional akin to paranoia? Suspicion at every delta change for data is a lot to ask for anyone. Brian, I'd like you to take that if you don't mind, please.
Yeah, so that's an interesting perspective. I think I'll kind of read a couple of things into the question and sort of take it where I think you might be headed, right? So is it paranoia? I don't know that it's paranoia as much as it is proactive. I think for zero trust to be to be effective, you've really got to be thinking proactively. Too many times in security we're thinking reactively. We see an exploit, we race to fix it. We see a POAM, we race to mitigate it and document it, and retroactively or retrospectively thinking about security. What zero trust is all about is thinking proactively. So getting out in front of it. Where do I think my users need to go? How do I know that the user would need to be able to access this or that thing? What sorts of devices are we going to allow? Not what sorts of devices are we not going to allow, but what sorts of devices are we going to allow? So, those positive control aspects of security really are where zero trust is focused. Being able to understand the types of scenarios that your users, your NPEs, your non-person entities, your systems need to communicate at. thinking proactively about what sorts of data should be traveling through my network. If you think about, we talked about data loss prevention or exfiltration of data. Having an idea of data that should and shouldn't be traversing your network. If you're looking at your endpoints and you're seeing, specific markings of documents traveling through your endpoints, that's a very obvious example, but you can certainly go a lot deeper. And then really where the interesting front of Zero Trust is going is to try and integrate things like AI, natural language processing, trying to integrate more, more articulate or dynamic checks on everything that a policy enforcement point does. So, is it sort of paranoid? No, but I think it has to be proactive. You have to be thinking about your security in a positive sort of way.
I think that was an excellent point. It actually, I would say it could actually reduce my paranoia levels as a former CISO. So I think the looking at it from a proactive way that could actually reduce our anxiety levels is I would totally agree with that approach. Last question. We only got a couple minutes here left. I'm just going to throw this out to whoever jumps on it. There's a couple of questions that have come up around implementing Zero Trust, sort of where does it start? But one of the ones that's kind of interesting here is it looks like there is a CSP provider, a cloud provider that is asking about implementing Zero Trust on their side, not on the customer side. I'm assuming that's sort of a Zero Trust as a service offering, maybe, that he's asking about on the CSP side. Any thoughts on something like that? Haven't really heard anything about anything kind of moving in that direction, but just seemed like an interesting topic to me, so I figured I'd throw it out to the group.
I think, so there's probably a couple of models that they could look at. What I think what I'm hearing is something along the lines of like a cloud security gateway for the cloud services that they provide, right? So obviously there is, there's a couple of options for doing something like a policy enforcement point, policy decision point. Certainly, don't sleep on, and we didn't talk about it much, but another really important aspect of Zero Trust is the auditing and monitoring. You're getting so much more data that you can do something with. So, if you're sitting in a CSP's shoes, you've got a lot of information, really valuable information traveling over your network. So, maybe even start thinking about how you could do something along dynamic provisioning of roles or dynamic aspects that would allow for policy enforcement point and policy decision point decisions to be done better.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. That's a great answer.
I would add to that. It would be an opportunity.
Yeah, Vic, please jump in. What was that?
I would just say it would be an opportunity for CSP to create templates of Zero Trust solutions, right? So one of the powers of a cloud provider is the ability to spin up a solution very quickly. So just having those types of options available to customers, templates that can be spun up very quickly that fall in line with this architecture would be like a fantastic opportunity.
Yeah, no, another great point. I was interested in hearing your answer on that also, Vic. Kind of hearing what the Forcepoint thought would be around something like that. So thank you for chiming in. Like I said, I think that we're about out of time here. I think we got about 1 minute left. So just really wanted to thank everyone for attending today, but especially thank our panelists. Brian, I know you got to be just slammed right now. You talked earlier about all the hats that you're wearing. Man, I just can't thank you enough for making the time to be here with us today and for really kind of pulling back the curtain and giving us a lot of insights into what you're doing specifically and what you're seeing more broadly in the government. And just thank you to everyone for giving us, I think, really meaningful, actionable types of information around Zero Trust today. So just thank you all very, very much.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Appreciate it as well.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And with that, I think we're going to wrap up the discussion today. Again, thank you everyone for attending, and especially thank the panelists, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you. Bye.